The Shadow of the Forest. Prologue. The forest holds many secrets, but some are better left undiscovered. Deep within its shadows lies something dark and unseen, hiding from human eyes but always present. Visitors to this cursed place speak of strange sounds, shadows moving on their own, and the constant feeling of being watched. Alex and Jenny knew nothing of these legends when they moved into their new home deep in the forest. For them, this place was meant to be a peaceful refuge where they could start a new life. But they had no idea that the forest had other plans. What began as a simple journey in search of peace quickly turned into a terrifying nightmare. What is hidden in the thick darkness of this forest? Is it just a legend, or is there something more, something beyond human comprehension? Alex and Jenny vanished without a trace, and no one can explain what happened to them. Their final cry for help remains unanswered, but the mystery lives on. The forest is still there, waiting, watching, and it never forgets those who dared to enter its depths. Chapter 1. A New Beginning. Alex and Jenny arrived at the old house, deep in the forest, just before dusk. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows over the landscape, giving the surroundings a surreal, almost mystical aura. The house, though old and in need of some repairs, seemed like the perfect place to start anew. "We did it," Jenny said with a smile, squeezing Alex's hand. "This is our place, our sanctuary." Alex nodded, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "It's definitely secluded," he replied, glancing around at the dense woods that seemed to encroach upon the house from all sides. They spent the evening unpacking and settling in, their excitement overshadowing any sense of apprehension. But as night fell, a strange stillness descended upon the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on the couple from all sides. "Did you hear that?" Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fireplace. Alex listened intently, but there was nothing. Just silence. "It's probably just the wind," he reassured her, though he himself wasn't convinced. That night they both slept uneasily, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edge of their consciousness. The next day, Alex and Jenny explored the area around their new home. The forest was thick, the trees towering high above, their branches intertwining to form a near impenetrable canopy. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of earth and moss filled their lungs. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to notice strange markings on the trees, deep gouges as if something had clawed at the bark. "Maybe a bear," Alex suggested, though the marks were too high up and too deep for any bear he had ever seen. Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't like this, Alex. Maybe we should head back." But Alex was intrigued. "Let's just go a bit further. We need to know what's out here." They continued for another hour, finding more of the strange markings and then something even more disturbing. A small clearing with a circle of stones, charred as if by fire, but with no sign of recent activity. "This doesn't look natural," Jenny said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." Alex agreed this time, and they hurried back to the house. But the unease followed them, a creeping dread that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. At first, it was just the rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch. But then, as the hours wore on, the noises became more distinct, soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. "Do you hear that?" Jenny asked, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Alex nodded, his face pale. "It's like voices, but I can't make out what they're saying." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to convey some urgent message. But no matter how hard they strained to listen, the words remained just out of reach, like a secret on the tip of the tongue. The next morning, Alex found the front door open, though he was sure he had locked it the night before. He checked the house but found no sign of forced entry. Maybe it was the wind, he said, though he didn't believe it himself. But Jenny was not so easily reassured. "Something is here, Alex. Something in this forest. It doesn't want us here." Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Objects in the house began to move on their own, chairs shifting positions, books falling off shelves, doors slamming shut without warning. And always there were the whispers, growing louder and more persistent with each passing night. Jenny became increasingly withdrawn, her once bright eyes now dull with fear. "We need to leave," she pleaded. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." But Alex was determined to stay. "This is our home now," he insisted. "We can't just run away because of some strange noises." But deep down, he too was afraid. The forest, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt like a living entity, watching their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as they lay in bed, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, a suffocating void that seemed to swallow all sound. And then from the darkness outside came a low, guttural growl. "Did you hear that?" Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's out there, whatever it is." They sat in the dark, holding their breath as the growling grew closer, reverberating through the walls of the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The next morning they found deep claw marks on the front door, identical to the ones they had seen on the trees. "We have to leave," Jenny said again, her voice filled with desperation. But Alex was resolute. "No, we're staying. We can't let this, whatever it is, scare us away." Despite Alex's determination, the situation continued to deteriorate. The whispers, the growls, the moving objects, all of it seemed to be building to something that neither of them could comprehend. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, trying to find some comfort in the warmth of the flames, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. Alex rushed in to find that every cupboard door had been flung open, and all the contents, plates, glasses, silverware, were scattered across the floor. "Enough is enough," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm going out there. I'm going to find whatever it is that's doing this and put an end to it." "No, Alex, please," Jenny begged. "Don't go out there. It's too dangerous." But Alex was beyond reason. Grabbing a flashlight and a large kitchen knife, he stormed out of the house and into the forest, the beam of light cutting through the thick darkness like a knife. For hours he wandered through the woods, calling out into the night, challenging whatever was out there to show itself. But the forest remained silent, the only sound the crunching of leaves underfoot. Finally, exhausted and defeated, Alex turned to head back to the house. But as he did, he realized that he was lost. The trees, which had once seemed so familiar, now loomed like towering, menacing figures, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. And then, from the darkness, came the growl again, this time much closer. Alex spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions, but he saw nothing. "Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response, only the growing sense of dread that seemed to suffocate him, pressing in from all sides. Back at the house, Jenny sat by the window, her eyes wide with fear, staring out into the darkness. She could feel it too, the presence that had been tormenting them, growing stronger, more malevolent. And then she saw it, a figure just on the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the night. It stood there, motionless, watching her. Jenny screamed, but her voice was lost in the void. She stumbled back from the window, her heart racing. She knew she had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But as she turned to run, she felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, but she could feel the presence all around her, closing in. She ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge, locked from the outside. Panic surged through her as she banged on the door, screaming for Alex, but the only response was the silence, deep and all-encompassing. And then the whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever before. They filled her mind, drowning out all thought, all reason. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her head, trying to shut them out, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure standing in the doorway, its eyes burning into her soul. Maxim left the village, determined to uncover the mystery of the forest shadow. He consulted ancient texts, questioned occult scholars, and traveled to other places where similar phenomena had been reported. But the more he learned, the more he realized that the shadow was not just a local spirit or ghost. It was something more, something with roots deep in time, connected to humanity itself. After months of searching, Maxim came to the conclusion that he would not find the answers in books or ancient rituals. To discover the truth, he had to return to the place where it all began. He decided to visit the abandoned house once again, where he had last seen his sister. The forest greeted him like an old friend, grim, silent, only now it seemed even more sinister. Every tree, every rustling branch seemed suspicious to him. When Maxim entered the house, he felt a familiar chill of fear run down his spine. Everything was in its place, but the air felt heavy, as if the very space was saturated with darkness. Maxim decided to try the ritual once more, the one that had helped him before. But this time something was wrong. The candles refused to light, and the words he spoke had none of their former power. He felt that something had changed in the house, as if the shadow itself had been waiting for his return. Suddenly, distorted faces began to emerge from the darkness, the same ones he had seen before, but now they were clearer, more real. They stared at him, whispering his name, and he realized that these faces belonged to people who had once been taken by the shadow. Among them, he saw Jenny and Alex. Their faces were disfigured, their eyes empty, but they were looking directly at him. "You shouldn't have come back," Jenny whispered, but it wasn't her voice. Her lips moved, but the sounds that came out were foreign, sinister. The shadow began to close in on Maxim. He felt his body growing heavy, his thoughts becoming foggy. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move, as if they were rooted to the ground. Darkness enveloped him from all sides, forcing him to see what didn't exist, to feel pain beyond human comprehension. Maxim realized that he was losing control of himself, that his own mind was becoming a battlefield between light and darkness. But the light was too weak, and the darkness was gradually winning. The last thing he saw before his consciousness finally left him was Jenny's face. She stood before him, holding his hands, but this was not his sister. It was something else, something that used her image to drag him into the depths of darkness. The darkness filled his mind, consumed his soul, and Maxim knew he would never return. He had become part of the forest, part of the shadow that would always watch over those who dared to enter this cursed place. From that day on, no one saw Maxim again. His tracks disappeared just as Alex and Jenny's had. Only the forest remained a silent witness to all these events, hiding within its shadows yet another soul that vanished without a trace. The villagers no longer spoke of Maxim, Alex, or Jenny. They knew that those who dared to uncover the truth would forever become part of the shadow. And the forest continued its life, waiting for new brave souls who would try to unravel its mystery. After Maxim spent the night in the house, he began to notice strange things. At night, he could hear footsteps coming from the forest, just like Alex and Jenny. He felt a presence when he was alone, and the shadows that danced on the walls took shape. But the worst part was that he started to see faces. They appeared for a moment in the mirrors, in the reflections of the glass, in the darkness behind the windows. They were not just faces, but pale, distorted figures that seemed to be trying to reach him. Maxim began to understand that he was not alone in this house. The shadow he had previously thought was just a legend had now become his reality. He could feel her slowly consuming his will, making him see things that didn't exist. Maxim decided that it was necessary to leave this place immediately. He tried to escape from the house, but something seemed to hold him back. As he approached the door, it suddenly closed in front of him. He tried the windows, but they too were blocked by an unseen force. He was overcome with panic fear. He knew Shadow wouldn't let him just leave, but Maxim was determined, and despite his fear, he decided to fight. He remembered how his grandmother had told him about ancient rituals and protective spells that could help against dark forces. Maxim found candles from the previous residence in an old closet and arranged them in a circle. He lit them, standing in the middle of the circle, and began to read the words he remembered from childhood. The darkness around him grew thicker, and the shadows began to merge into one large figure. That was it. The shadow that followed him. The shadow was approaching him, and Maxim could feel his strength leaving him. She whispered in his ear, making him doubt his resolve. But he held on, reading the words louder and louder. The shadow paused for a moment, as if trying to figure out what to do next. Maxim felt something change in the air. He understood that he had a chance. He continued the ritual, and the shadow began to retreat. The light of the candles grew brighter, and the darkness around them dissolved. The shadow disappeared, dissolved in the air, leaving behind only the cold breath of the wind. Maxim remained alone in the house, surrounded by silence. He knew he had won, but he also knew that the shadow could still return. Maxim left the house the next morning without looking back. He went back to the city, leaving behind the forest that guarded its secrets. But the forest did not forget him. Maxim felt that something was always watching him from the shadows, even when he was far from that place. He understood that he would never be able to completely free himself from this curse. The villagers were silent again about the events that happened in the forest. They knew that the shadow would always find new victims, and that this forest would never be a safe place. But Maxim will never forget that night. He decided to devote his life to the search for the truth about this place and about the shadow that would always remain his shadow. Epilogue, the Eternal Watcher. Years passed, and the village near the forest continued its quiet existence. The tales of the vanished souls, Alex, Jenny, and Maxim, became part of local folklore, whispered among the villagers as cautionary stories to keep the curious at bay. The forest, now more feared than ever, became a place no one dared to enter. Its dark reputation grew, and soon it was known as the Forest of Shadows. But the forest was not done with its tale. The shadow that had claimed Alex, Jenny, and Maxim was not merely an entity that consumed souls. It was a living, breathing force, an ancient presence that fed on fear, growing stronger with each victim it claimed. One day, a group of hikers, unaware of the forest's dark past, decided to explore its depths. They were drawn by the forest's mysterious allure, the thrill of venturing into the unknown. As they ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around them, the air growing thicker, the silence more oppressive. The sun, which had shone brightly when they began their journey, now barely pierced the dense canopy above. The hikers began to feel uneasy, but none wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. They pressed on, trying to shake off the feeling that they were being watched. But the forest was patient. It waited until they were deep within its grasp before it revealed itself. It started with the whispers, soft at first, barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. But as they continued, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around them like a shroud. The hikers looked at each other in confusion, fear beginning to take hold. One by one, they began to see things. Shadows flitting between the trees, figures just out of sight, the feeling of cold hands brushing against their skin. Panic set in. They turned to flee, but the forest had changed. The paths they had taken were gone, replaced by dense thickets and twisted trees. The more they ran, the deeper they seemed to plunge into the heart of the forest, and the shadows followed, relentless in their pursuit. As night fell, the hikers found themselves in a small clearing, the same one where Alex and Jenny had once stood, where the stones lay charred and blackened. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, tall and thin, its eyes glowing like embers. The hikers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as the figure began to move toward them, its steps slow and deliberate. The whispers became a roar, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing: leave. But it was too late. The forest had them now, and it would not let them go. One by one, the hikers disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The forest claimed them, as it had claimed all the others before, and as the last of them vanished, the clearing returned to its eerie silence, the figure fading back into the shadows. The village, unaware of the hikers' fate, continued on as it always had. The forest remained an eternal watcher, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to enter its domain. And the shadow within it grew stronger, feeding on the fear and despair of those it claimed, ensuring that the legend of the Forest of Shadows would never die. For those who disappeared, there would be no return, no escape from the darkness that had taken them. They were now part of the forest, bound to its shadows for eternity, their whispers joining the chorus that echoed through the trees, a warning to all who dared to enter. But the forest was patient. It knew that eventually someone would come, drawn by the mystery, the thrill of the unknown. And when they did, the shadow would be waiting, ready to add another soul to its collection. Such an unexpected and terrible ending to the story emphasizes that sometimes mysteries are better left unsolved. What do you think? Write in the comments. If you like the story, please like it and also subscribe to the channel to see more stories.